Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription. Let's get started.
Now, one thing we see all the time is that, and this is especially for the accounting firms, the seller owners are often the ones that are holding most of the client relationships. It's a very owner-dependent client relationships. And if that knowledge transfer isn't handled carefully, when the acquisitions happen, you're basically just buying a book of business that could just walk out the door. So how do you recommend handling that kind of a scenario?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think that's critical, particularly even all the businesses that we buy. Obviously, you want a good slice or composition of the seller's client base, right? You want to understand who their top 10 clients are, what percentage of the top 10 clients are as the overall portfolio. Now, if they're spread out, that's great. You probably have a little bit less risk in terms of just a max exodus walking out the door or a heavy ticket client walking out the door. But if you do have a heavy client, you've got to be creative and thoughtful. Sometimes, when we come up on an attractive acquisition opportunity and there's a large captive client on the other side, we do sometimes reach out to them prior to the signing to get sort of, the connection and get the temperature as to whether the client's actually happy with continuing the relationship. Because that's critical.
Nice.
Because if you can't get that comfort, you're effectively you're buying it. And then the other way to go around it as well could be a clawback or a holdback in terms of what the purchase price would be. If you feel like the client base is of high risk, but the seller's telling you that they're not, you can negotiate, terms, all various different ways to do it. It can either be a clawback or it can go in escrow, or, you can hold back.
Welcome to another episode of Accounting M&A Insider. I'm your host, Saul. Today, we're diving into a topic that often gets overlooked but can make or break a deal. What happens after the ink is dry? We've all heard stories. A deal closes with fanfare only for chaos to set in once integration begins. That's why I'm excited to have Keith Crawford here with us. Keith leads integration at State Street and has worked both on the deal side and the integration side. He knows exactly where things tend to fall apart and how to avoid it. Keith, it's great to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Now, before we get started, you had experience on both ends, the deal team and the integration team. So what drew you to focus on the tricky handoff between these two worlds?
Yeah, so I don't think it happened by choice, but it happened by virtue of the role that I assumed when I joined State Street. It's a couple things: the nature of the organization and the nature of the acquisitions that we were looking at. If you take a look at custody security services, as they call it, they grew up in many different forms, but most of them were done as part of universal banks or retail banks. And so we do the back office, middle office processing, custodial services, fund accounting, fund administration. And historically, back maybe 20, 30 years ago, all the banks did this in-house themselves. Now, we've become a specialized trust bank in this area. And as a result, if we want to grow via acquisition, more times than not, we're actually doing what you call a carve-out transaction. And a carve-out transaction can be very, very cumbersome, very complex from an operational perspective, particularly trying to figure out how you segregate these operations out of the universal bank. And the universal bank has many common services that they're providing to not just the business that we're interested in, they're providing it to many businesses within the actual universal bank. And so that's the trick. And that's where, I've spent a lot of my time in terms of on the negotiation side, trying to get an understanding as to number one, what is the perimeter? And then number two, what are the dependencies and what do we need to do in the future state? And that's a
Right.
pretty intuitive process, I think, that requires a lot of thought, a lot of resources, and a lot of experts around the table.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, in one of your episodes on other platforms, you had mentioned that integration often gets sidelined until it's too late. Why is that?
Yeah, I think that's it's a combination of things, and it could be unique to the deal. I mean, most times when you're negotiating a transaction, time is of the essence. They need to go quickly, confidentiality needs to be maintained, and the longer a transaction goes on, you have a greater risk of actually the transaction not the parties not getting to terms. And then you also
Yeah.
have the risk of the transaction leaking, which neither party wants. And then
Right.
if you think back on that to prevent the transaction from leaking, there's only a handful of people that know in both organizations about the proposed transaction. And so
Yeah.
in most instances, I will tell you that the individuals that are in that initial negotiation on both sides probably doesn't have a very experienced, detailed head of HR, head of operations, head of IT that actually understands the actual business that's trying to be carved out. And so it's this careful balance. You've got to figure out when you bring them in and when you can open up on the other side. Sellers are very reluctant to bring other people into their shop, have them sit down, show them what the structure of their underlying service components are. And so that's kind of the debate. But at some point, you're really going to have them at the table for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. We will have to have them on the table. I've actually had a podcast on that, when you should have those teams coming in, when we should have start having those difficult conversations with employees and everything. But that's a discussion for some other time. From your experience, can you paint us a picture, right? What does a broken handoff actually look like in real life? Probably take an example from one of your prior deals.
Yeah, sure. So on a large carve-out transaction that I had done, probably in the last 5 years, it really involves, like I said, it's as you said, before you actually sign the transaction, you'd like to get at least a skeletal component of the integration team of who's going to be actively involved in the integration. You want to sit down with them and run them through what you're actually negotiating
Yeah.
for the transaction. But you also, from a legal perspective, you want to protect yourself in terms of should services not be supported by the bank for a period of time, and that's usually taken care of in a transition services agreement. And so that's really the first step that you actually want to get somebody actively involved. And then from then on, when you sign the transaction, it's public. In most instances, it's publicly announced. It's subject to regulatory approval, which could be anywhere from 9 to 12 to 15 months. And that is the critical time in which I think the integration team needs to be expanded with the right individuals on there, and they need to interact with the seller fairly quickly. And in some instances, we actually hire, external third parties to actually program manage it. And then ultimately, if it's a large deal, I suggest you have sort of a 100-day plan that you set from the closing. And
Nice.
and to ensure that you're actually building that foundational transition to make sure that, post the 100 days, the business is close to being integrated or on its way to being integrated and under the appropriate estimates that happened, between signing and closing and then post-closing.
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of MyCPE One to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
I got you. I got you. Now, I've read that, this is something that I've read somewhere that, 70 to 90% of the M&A deals, they fail to deliver their intended value. I mean, in the cases where where they have failed, I mean, and one of the biggest culprits is poor integration planning. So I completely agree to you there. The integration team needs to be in place. But from your perspective, what's truly at stake when the integration team isn't aligned with the deal team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issues at that point are uh, the deal team may underestimate the cost to achieve the
Yeah.
future state. I think that's one of the bigger things. You talk about migration. We have a rule of thumb and how we go through and we work on it. But we need to battle test that. We need to battle test
Mhm.
that with the integration team because if we're a factor of 2 to 5 times below that, that's going to have a material impact on what the return on the transaction can be. And it could
Mhm.
delay the actual closing if you're not ready to go day one. So critical. I think it's incredibly critical that you get that alignment with the team. Unfortunately for me, I've seen issues that arise, but nothing that would actually delay the closing. But there have been fire drills to get to the closing date or the intended closing date as well.
Interesting. Now let's flip this. All right. In your experience, what's the ideal timing and structure for a proper M&A handoff meeting? I remember you talked about a 100-day plan, but what is it like? Or even a playbook? Walk us through that. The timing and structure of a proper M&A handoff meeting.
Sure, I would say to do a quality, commercially standard transaction, it probably takes 3 months from the initial bid to get to a signing. And that encompasses sort of your initial non-binding indication to the seller. And then, obviously there's follow-up questions and the like. If you're accepted, if it's a competitive process, you're accepted with, they pare it down to 1, 2, unlikely 3, but sometimes 3 players. And you go through the process and they have a fairly detailed data room and they keep it pretty efficient. Obviously, there's bankers on our side and bankers on their side that are facilitating the transaction. And then if you do get to the final point where you confirm your price and you confirm your terms, then you go into that kind of long form legal discussion and legal negotiation. And it's that period of time that I think we bring the experts for the integration to the table to do their preliminary work and to test our model to make sure that our model isn't, as I said earlier, off by a factor of 2 to 5 times or whatever it may be, and to sure that there's some sanity in the underlying assumptions going forward. And then we sort of work through the agreements. And when the agreements are there, we're pretty close to signing and closing. We have disclosure requirements and material requirements as an SEC traded company as well. So I would say ideally, that's a good period of time. I would say they've been longer as of late. I can't put my finger on it. But I do think, transactions that take a long time, that every day that goes beyond what you hope the target date is, you have a higher risk of it not getting there at the end.
Hmm. Well, you kind of just answer the next question that I was going to ask you that, who do you plan to have in that room? But you kind of answered it already off because especially in accounting firm mergers and acquisitions, because that's something that we do a lot. I've seen that a lot of small firms, I mean, this has happened, in fact, where the handoff is literally just a buyer emailing over a signed LOI and saying, all right, figure it out.
Yeah.
So,
So
so,
yeah,
so
on
what's your,
that point, I mean, I think it's critical to have HR, operational HR and HR, not just the head of HR, people who are actually going to figure out um, day one how it's critical day one how the employees on the other side are going to get paid. Um,
yeah.
it sounds like a very basic thing, but operationally that can be a very intensive and time sensitive, complex thing. The other one is the head of operations or someone on the operations teams that fully understands day one what needs to be required, what all the interdependencies are. And then on top of that is the IT folks. And there's got to be a segregation day one. We're federally regulated. So we need to have, separate physical location, separate emails, everything needs to be firewalled and done the appropriate way. So there's a lot of planning that needs to happen to get to that phase.
I like it. I like it. Now let's bring this home to accounting firm deals, right? What integration pitfalls do you see as unique in this space?
Yeah. So I thought about this. I don't think this is all that dissimilar from asset management transactions. And we have an asset manager one of the world's largest asset managers in our portfolio. I've done asset management transactions, and I think it's similar in the way that you're buying people.
Yeah.
In terms
Yeah.
of you're buying the intellectual know-how and knowledge of people with accounting firms. Sure, they have clients, but those people are critical, right? They have a close relationship with those clients, and you want to preserve those clients, and you want to
Yeah.
preserve the relationships. And so that's the critical component. So culturally, do you fit with them, right? Are they culturally a good fit? It sounds like a generic thing to say, but it's not. I think, sometimes when I go in and I look at asset management firms, there's asset managers out there that do very well. They're incredibly successful, but they're managing exclusively to their bottom line, what they take home every year. And it works for them. That's great, but that's a different culture from what we are. We're more
Yeah.
client-oriented, client service, compliance, good risks and controls, good oversight. So sometimes when you go in, I can find out in the first half hour in a conversation if there's a target company we're talking to. I know right away whether they're driven for the P&L, they lack on the control standards. And look, they're successful, that's great, but that's not really culturally how we do. And the transaction probably wouldn't work if we tried to force it in any event anyway.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
I agree. I agree. Now, one thing we see all the time is that, and this is especially for the accounting firms, the seller owners are often the ones that are holding most of the client relationships. It's a very owner dependent client relationships. And if that knowledge transfer isn't handled carefully when the acquisitions happen, you're basically just buying a book of business that could just walk out the door. So, how do you recommend handling that kind of a scenario?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think that's critical, particularly even all the businesses that we buy. Obviously, um, you want a good slice or composition of the seller's client base, right? You want to understand
Yeah.
who their top 10 clients are, what percentage of the top 10 clients are as the overall portfolio. Now, if they're
Right.
spread out, that's great. You probably have a little bit less risk in terms of just a max exodus walking out the door or a heavy ticket client walking out the door. But if you do have a heavy client, you've got to be creative and thoughtful. Sometimes, when we come up on an attractive acquisition opportunity and there's a large captive client on the other side, we do sometimes reach out to them prior to the signing to get sort of, the connection and get the temperature as to whether the client's actually happy with continuing the relationship. Because that's critical, because
Nice.
if you can't get that comfort, you're effectively you're buying it. And then the other way to go around it as well is to could be a clawback or a holdback in terms of what the purchase price would be. If you feel like the client base is of a high risk, but the seller's telling you that they're not, you can negotiate terms, all various different ways to do it. It can either be a clawback or it can go in escrow, or you can hold back. And so those
Yeah.
are those are other functions that you can use. I think that I would recommend, obviously for CPA acquirers as well. And then in terms of trying to ensure that you have consistency and continuity with the clients, I think it's really a bespoke effort, but what it should be is shadowing the incumbent client service representative in the acquired firm with somebody
Right.
who is probably going to be in the acquiring firm longer to make sure you create that continuity and that overlap.
Yeah.
And it all depends. I mean, sometimes there are CPA firms where the owner wants to leave, but you probably want them to stay, right? The owners want to leave, take their money and run and go and retire or go do something else. But I do think there is a lot of sanity in terms of getting a proper retention period for them to do a transition over where you can actually convey and do all these client rollovers in terms of getting an understanding and making sure. But then your brand needs to be good too, because if you don't have a good brand, it might be a fait accompli that you're going to lose many clients anyway.
All right. Now, M&A as a transaction, it's all data. There is a lot of numbers involved, right? So let me ask you this. Let's talk about measurement. What are the 2 or 3 key matrices that you look at to know if an integration is on course?
Yeah, that's a great question. That I look at in terms of how we judge the potential success. I look at the actual economics. So the actual per the actual P&L. The actual P&L as you're going through. Did we assume it right? Do we have cost overruns? Is the cost achieved higher than we originally estimated? So that's a good gauge on the macro, I think, in terms of how it's working. And then you drill down from there, retention of clients, right? And I
Right.
think it'd be silly to go into every transaction and think that you're going to retain 100% of clients. We don't.
Mhm.
We have an estimate. We factor that into our valuation and our financial model. So I mean,
Mhm.
what are you tracking? Are the clients still retained? Have we lost clients? What does that mean? And then the other area that is critical, as we said, with the CPA firms, similar to the asset management firms, have you retained the key employees? And that's critical because you're buying human, the human element, and that's critical for your business to scale and grow going forward.
No, I agree too. And I think you brought a very interesting point that you should always be ready for that room of losing some, because you can't expect that everything is going to be 100%. You got to keep that room into that discussion. That's a very interesting point. So thank you for bringing that out. Because, and there's this thing that, this is actually from a PwC report wherein, they've done a survey and they found out that, 50% of the executives, that don't track the integration performance with like a formal KPI, which can like like really make or break a deal. So how do you build accountability into the handoff without slowing the process down?
Yeah, we that's a good point. I do think if you're going to be a moderate to serial acquirer and you don't institute KPIs into your integration, um, I think you're kind of flying blind there because I think there's a lot of good there's a lot of good information that comes out of every single transaction that I think you can use for the following transaction to make it better, more efficient, and be able to do it quicker. So KPIs absolutely the way to go. Um,
Mhm.
and I think ignoring it would be detrimental. Again, I don't think pushing through on those things on an as needed basis. It needs to be structured. But you can't slow down the process. So you got to be careful. It's a balance. So you don't want to be too heavy handed in terms of, hey, we got to meet every day and see how we're doing on the integration. No. Is it every day? No. Might be every week, right? Maybe
Yeah.
it's every 2 weeks, depending on the pace and the size of the transaction. So you've got to curtail it to the profile and the dynamic of what you're acquiring. But as you said, you do not want to impede or slow down the integration effort. You actually want to accelerate it, and you want to be available to actually remediate things that come up, on a daily basis or immediately on a basis so that you can get the wheels turning again on that.
Yeah. I think the key word over here is you got to be available, right? Because especially when the seller is somebody retiring out of the business, maybe the person has been doing it for a long time and they feel that, okay, I've got my money. Now it's up to the integration team and boom, you know, but that's not a good strategy. But anyway, uh, before I let you go to wrap up, if I were to ask you, what's the one thing that every firm should document before closing to set themselves up for a smooth integration?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it earlier in the discussion. I think it's a plan. Whether it be 100-day plan, I don't know. It depends on how quickly things go. Some industries may have a shorter plan and a shorter migration, but you should have some outline of that plan and what that plan should be. The sooner you do it, I think you start to see all the areas, all the gaps that you need to fill in, and then heck, it starts to get you on the right path. And if you don't have that, I feel like again, you're just kind of like being reactionary that rather than proactive.
Yeah. And for the leaders who are listening in, especially those who are managing the very first post acquisition integration, what's your one piece of advice to them to help them sleep better at night?
I'd say it's to be flexible and to be structured but unstructured because
Right.
there's no one transaction that's the same. So you got to kind of play in that middle and be prepared to actually exert the right format and structure when the time comes, but to also understand that you're going to have to pivot on information that you didn't know about. And when you get into diligence, you got to be ready to be flexible and agile.
All right. Perfect. Now, this has been great. Now, where can people connect with you if they would like to learn more?
I'm on LinkedIn. I do podcasts from time to time, and I thank you again for bringing me on this. But yeah, LinkedIn, reach out. Happy to have a conversation.
All right, great. All right, for all the folks who are listening in, I will be sharing Keith's LinkedIn into the show notes as well, so you have that handy. And with that, Keith, I want to thank you for sharing your insights and the playbook on integration handoffs. So thank you
Great.
so much for your time. Yep. And to our listeners, if you're in the middle of a deal or even just starting to think about one, remember the deal doesn't close at the end. It's in many ways that's where the real work begins. All right. So if you found today's episode valuable, be sure to subscribe, share it with your colleagues, and check out our past episodes on the human, financial, and strategic sides of M&A in accounting. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Saul, and this was Accounting M&A Insider. Till next time, take care and keep innovating in everything that you do. Cheers.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now